Thank you, Charlotte. As soon as I started talking to Colonel Koenig about Operation Market Garden, it dawned on me that he knew a lot more than I would ever know. So he is my co-lecturer this evening. Colonel was born in Cheyenne, Wyoming, military brat, so he also lived in Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, graduated high school from Rosewood, 1988, graduated NC State, 1996, entered the Army as an airborne infantryman in 1988, commissioned in the Army as airborne infantry officer in 1996, transferred to the Air Force as an engineer in 2003, went over to the dark side. Currently serves as director of staff of the 4th Fighter Wing, so he's my boss, and he's a great boss. He's a master-rated parachutist with 1 combat jump, combat infantry badge, expert infantry badge, Pathfinder, and Ranger qualified. So I couldn't even begin to do the stuff that this guy does. So thank you so much, Colonel, for joining us. How many of you have seen the movie A Bridge Too Far? Excellent. That gives you an excellent foundation of knowledge. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about for this lecture tonight, because I think more than any film that's ever been made, that movie showed an entire military campaign from the planning stages through the end better than Hollywood has ever done that, and we're going to talk about part of the reason why that is. So here we go, Operation Market Garden. You've heard me talk about the 2 world wars at the very beginning. We don't have enough stuff, people, equipment, anything. So we've got to risk it all, Midway, Doolittle raid. That's the only way we were going to turn the tide. Now, in 1944, the tide has turned. Now we have greater amounts of trained soldiers, equipment, than anybody else. One of my favorite expressions, quantity has a quality all its own. Fewer risks have to be taken now because we're on the way to victory, both in Europe and in the Pacific. Situation in Europe, September 1944. Lots of victories for us, lots of defeats for the Germans, lots of Germans surrendering. This is what situation looks like. This is what we have taken since D-Day. A lot of this is irrelevant. The main thing is massive Russian armies heading this way and a massive English, British, Canadian force heading this way. This is the industrial heartland of Germany, and we're almost there. Northwestern Europe, 1944, shows you some of the units involved. Again, no need to worry about that too much. Situation in Europe, again, like I said, Russians are coming in from one side, we're coming in from the other side. In some sectors, Germans are retreating faster than we can advance. Something happened September 5th, 1944 in Holland. They called it Dolle Dienstag, Mad Tuesday. What happened was there was a radio broadcast that said that the Allies had advanced into Holland. Well, what did the German forces in Holland do when that happened? They skedaddled. It's like they're coming, we're leaving. And we saw that, and that gave us a false impression of German military might in Holland. The big challenge, the last great natural barrier between us and Nazi Germany, the Rhine River. That's what this campaign is all about. Leadership in the West, Eisenhower, Montgomery, Bradley. Eisenhower in charge of the whole shebang. Now, something significant happened just before this took place. September 1st, 44, Eisenhower formally takes over command of the battle from Montgomery. Montgomery's not too happy about that. Eisenhower's role is keeping the Allied armies together and placating a lot of the personalities, Montgomery and Patton in particular. Field Marshal Montgomery, his glory days in the desert beating Rommel. Eisenhower's committed to a broad front strategy. We're advancing against the Germans, and Montgomery wants a single thrust. In other words, let's concentrate all of our military power with one sector and drive through that. And of course, who should lead that single thrust? Montgomery, of course, based on Montgomery. If we did that, it would give Montgomery the prestige of leading the fight into Germany. General Omar Bradley, he didn't agree with that. He was opposed to Montgomery. He thought we won in Normandy despite Montgomery, that Montgomery was plotting and not willing to advance as rapidly as he could. Bradley wanted us, with victory in sight, it was time for American military power to take precedence in Western Europe over the British. German leadership, I don't know who these guys are, but I thought the uniforms were cool. The guy in charge, General Marshal Walter Model. He's in charge of Army Group B, the defense of Holland and Northwest Germany. He's known as the Führer's fireman, because on the Eastern Front, when the Russians are breaking through, he was able to take charge of a rout and turn it into a counterattack. So he has a good record of being an on-the-scene commander. He tells Rundstedt, his boss, he needs 25 additional divisions to halt the Allied advance, but when push comes to shove, he's going to do what he needs to do with the resources at hand. This is Wilhelm Bittrich. He is in charge of the 2nd Panzer Corps. These two armored tank divisions were in the Falaise pocket, which we bombed the heck out of, and they suffered tremendous casualties. So German leadership decided, let's take them and put them in a nice, quiet sector. They mentioned this in the movie. Where do we put them? Arnhem. That's how they wind up in Arnhem. General Kurt Student. He's former commander of German Airborne Forces, so he knows all about how to use them, which means he also knows how to fight them, because he knows what they're capable of, what they're not capable of. He takes charge of a lot of the forces in Holland that have to be rallied when Operation Market Garden commences. Weak in infantry, but strong in artillery and assault guns. What does airborne troops have? A whole lot of none, artillery and assault guns. So they had a lot of stuff that they were able to put to good use. Montgomery's plan, single thrust through Holland, lightning drive, cross over the Rhine, drive into the industrial heartland of Germany, and the war in 1944. Market is the first portion of the plan. That is the airborne drop. And Colonel, you want to take this one?
I can do that. All right, from this part, based off my background, I'm going to talk to it from the perspective of it as an airborne guy. Their objective was to parachute behind the enemy's lines and secure key objectives, being a series of a little over a dozen bridges throughout the Netherlands. And that's what these are, with the culminating one being the Nijmegen Bridge in Arnhem. What most people don't know is there's two parts of the Rhine in the Netherlands, Nijmegen and Arnhem. So, this is how the airborne forces were supposed to be distributed, with 101st Airborne parachuting outside Eindhoven, near the town of Best, Zoon, and Veghel, and St. Odenrode. The 82nd Airborne parachuting into Grave and Groesbeek, and then the 1st Airborne into Oosterbeek, outside Arnhem. Next slide. All right, the follow-up portion of this was Garden with the British 30 Corps tanks, which would punch through the Belgian border and go up a supposedly 2-lane road all the way through, which created a whole series of challenges all in itself later. That the hedgerows, the ditches, and everything else through that part of the country, you want to drive all those tanks down a 2-lane road as you're fighting an enemy along the way. And the airborne forces are sporadically spread apart that to secure key objectives along the way to aid their advance. This is kind of what it looked like if you saw the movie. It's just a roadblock of tanks going down the road. And when one gets hit, the whole column stops. Here's the plan again from a different perspective, using a different map, punching through the border. You can see 30 Corps down here, and this was known as Hell's Highway to go up all the way into Arnhem to secure the final objectives. Total of about 67 miles of two-lane highway going through 3 major cities. The reason why Eisenhower accepted this plan was his chance to end the war early. What most people don't know about this is there were 13 previous airborne operations planned, most of them to seize key bridges to punch into Germany to try to end the war early. They settled on this one based off of Montgomery's determination and insistence on doing this, and that he would, lead the charge himself.
And when you think about it too, these airborne divisions, these are some of the most highly trained, efficient, excellent war-making divisions in the reservoir that the Allies have. So it makes sense you want to get them in the fight.
And to carry on with that, part of the airborne divisions, their mission this is what they do. They drop behind the enemy's lines, even though in Market Garden, this was farther and farther penetration that they've ever done. So it's audacity on their side. As you'll also see, it was done in daylight, which is unheard of. You don't do airborne operations in daylight, let alone combat operations. They, as it states up here, they're going to drop three airborne divisions. The British 1st Airborne Division, a separate Polish brigade with Sosabowski later on, the 82nd Airborne, and then the 101st Airborne. Something that you don't see talked about is all the gliders that went in. There was about 300 artillery pieces that were flown in by gliders, about 1,000 vehicles that came in by gliders, and that's a whole experience all by yourself. As a paratrooper, we always look back at the old glider guys, and the glider guys that said they jump out of an airplane with paratroopers, so there's no way they would ever come into a glider. It's a controlled crash, is pretty much what it is. But there were almost 3,000 gliders that went in as well. So there was a lot of people that went in. One of those gliders, and that's another thing that'll come in here. Some of the challenges that came up was we can't put a lot of combat power on the ground quick back then because one Dakota could only carry 28 paratroopers, where nowadays we're packing 120 guys in one airplane. So there's a big difference, and the gliders carried 13, which is a nice number to be thinking of if you're number 13 going in a glider. So, limitations was the ability to get people there quickly, and that's the assets that we had, and to put 35,000 paratroopers on the ground to do this was audacious all in itself, and the weather didn't cooperate. As you see in the movie, the movie's pretty factual when you look at it, of how it happened. That, the weather factored in on how these things occurred and how we're bringing in reinforcements and resupplying guys, because when a paratrooper jumps in, whatever's in his backpack's what he's got, and you're fighting with that. And that's what they go on, and then they need resupplied. As it states here, they got to be delivered to the initial drop zones. You have to, assemble quickly to put it in terms as everybody comes together. There were lessons learned on the D-Day invasion, which was a success all in itself, based off of the scatter pattern that was created, and guys were dropped everywhere, all over the place. So the Germans thought there's literally thousands and thousands of American British paratroopers. That they didn't want that to happen in Holland. They wanted everybody delivered into certain areas quickly, so that was the choice why they went to go with daylight. As it states here, it's also extremely difficult when you have wounded soldiers. They're there. You can't do anything with them. They didn't have helicopters back in where they could swoop in and take wounded guys out. They're on the ground until the cavalry arrives, which was 30 Corps. As it states, they're limited on what they can do. Everything's relying on 30 Corps and Montgomery's plan to push up that highway in the timeline that he set out. And so, the airborne forces go in with the limited supplies that they have to accomplish their mission, and they did. And, you'll hear Doc and I argue that at the end of, was this a success or not? And, the Germans that they expected to be there, they didn't expect. They overlooked intelligence reports. They disregarded them because, the Germans are on a withdrawal. We got it. So, we're just going to go in with overwhelming forces, and this will happen.
And think about this. Have Allied armies advanced 64 miles in 2 days? They sure have. But now we're saying you have to advance up this road where thousands of airborne troops are going to get killed. Whole different ballgame. Lieutenant General B.G. Horrocks, he was in charge of 30 Corps. He's Monty's protege. He was recovering from wounds when he's put in charge of 30 Corps. 20 August, this market garden's in September, his health collapses, and Monty conceals this. Puts him back in action, and maybe not the best person to be back in action when his health is not good. In retrospect, was it realistic that 30 Corps with Horrocks in command was going to be able to traverse the 95 kilometers to Arnhem in such a short period of time? Lieutenant General Louis Brereton, he was in charge of the 1st Airborne Army, so he's in charge of all 3 divisions. Hard-drinking World War I pilot, desperately wanted to get all 3 divisions on a single operation, sees himself as an organizer of air power rather than an army commander. Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Arthur Montague Boy Browning, Deputy Brereton, called by some the father of the British Airborne Forces. He would land with the 82nd and control things from there. Described as tall, mustached, well-poised, too deliberate a smile, cool and polished manner of an English gentleman. In other words, the Americans hated him, especially General Ridgway.
All right, General Maxwell Taylor was the commanding general of the 101st Airborne Division. His objectives, like I stated earlier, was to secure the main bridge in the city of Eindhoven and Veckel, about 25 kilometers up the road, the Wilhelmina Canal in Somme, the Domel Bridge in St. Oden Road, and the South Wilhelmina Canal and the Awe River in Veckel, which I had my great uncle actually parachuted to take that bridge in that operation. And Jumpin' Jim Gavin, youngest general officer in the Army at that time, commanding general of the 82nd Airborne Division. His objectives were to drop around the town of Grava at Grosbeek, seize the Maas River crossing in Grava, seize the Maas Wall Canal and the Wall Bridge in Nijmegen, and capture and hold Grosbeek Ridge. That's a key terrain feature that I'll point out something that's significant happened there that most people don't realize. Major General Urquhart, in charge of the British 1st Airborne. However, he wasn't a paratrooper. He came in a glider, which was an interesting thing almost in himself, but he was commanding an airborne division. And his objective was to secure the Rhine in Arnhem. Major General Sosabowski was in charge of the Polish Airborne Brigade that was to go in and jump in support of the British Airborne Division. And they were there to reinforce the British 1st Airborne Division at the Rhine Bridge in Arnhem. All right, I'm going to start using my pointer now, so you're going to have to bear with me a little bit. Point out these key bridges. This is the city of Eindhoven. It's a major city. It was the first city liberated in the Netherlands. This drop zone right here, they went into the town of Best, and there was a bridge here that's not on the map, and then Sohn, and then St. Oden Road, and then Veckel. I used to live in this little town right here called Udu when I was a kid. So I lived right off Hell's Highway, about 100 meters off of it. Up into Grava, which is where the 504th Parachute Infantry parachuted in from the 82nd Airborne Division, and they jumped on both sides of this bridge. And there's something interesting that I'll point out that you probably noticed in the movie, but you didn't know what happened with Robert Redford, who's Major Julian in the movie. He actually parachuted over here and ended up having to do that boat crossing way over there. The 505th and the 508th Parachute Infantries jumped into Grosbeek Heights over here, and then the British 1st Airborne is way on the outsides of Arnhem, which is a challenge all in itself, and the British should have said, that's a problem. They had to move all that distance to secure the bridge. They didn't have vehicles. This is what they had. That's a challenge.
And part of the problem, like the Colonel said, Urquhart wasn't an airborne paratrooper guy, so he didn't know to say, we're not gonna drop that far from the bridge.
And of these bridges, this one was actually blown up. So there was a floating Bailey's bridge that was brought in to reinforce this bridge. And that's why this bridge that was over here was important, is it was used while repairs were made on this so the flow can continue with 30 core tanks going into towards Arnhem. This is how the gliders went into Holland, and the transports and gliders flew across Belgium and then turned left into Eindhoven, and everybody else came in a different route. Slide is depicted right here. That the 101st Airborne's route was the southern route where the British 1st Airborne and 82nd came in over the Netherlands. Unique fact, most people don't know, this wasn't the first combat parachute jump in the Netherlands. The Germans actually seized the Netherlands in 1940 by combat parachute jump as well. Broad daylight, audacity. They don't think it's gonna happen. There's a book out there called It Never Snows in September, and that's from a German soldier's perspective looking at white parachutes coming down. They were completely caught off guard. The Dutch people, my stepmother was a Dutch national, was a little girl at this time, and they were coming out of church. So this is a great thing for the Dutch people on a Sunday afternoon to walk out of church and here are Americans falling out of the sky on you to liberate your country.
One of my favorite parts of A Bridge Too Far is when General Bittrich looks up in the sky and sees these hundreds and hundreds of planes and thousands of paratroopers and says, to have that kind of power in my hands just for a moment. Germans couldn't even imagine having that kind of power.
And in this slide, you'll see the Waco gliders on the ground already. That's what I was referring to as gliders. Those are Waco gliders. They're canvas and wood. And once they land, the pilot is now an infantryman. All right, initial successes. From my perspective as a former airborne paratrooper guy, audacity seized the day. They did what they were supposed to. The airborne forces seized the bridges. Even at Arnhem, the bridge was taken, and both sides were taken and then lost, and then the British held on to one side of it. They did what they were supposed to. Monty's tanks couldn't do what they were supposed to. So you're leaving these paratroopers strung out for days and days with limited ammunition, resupply, wounded and dead guys, trying to make this happen. There's a lot of heroic actions that went on for that. Quick comment here, the middle bullet. Pilots were warned not to deviate from their planned routes and altitudes. That came from Vice Air Marshal Tedder, who was in charge of all air operations and European theater operations. It was a result of the D-Day dispersal patterns. They had Dakota pilots that were dropping the load to avoid flak-in. When they put their paratroopers out, the parachutes never opened. These guys just impacted the ground and died. So the pilots were out to themselves, to protect themselves, is why when you look at the D-Day invasion, there were paratroopers all over the peninsula. And Air Marshal Tedder didn't want that to happen. And what I read is he threatened to court-martial any pilot that deviated from the flight plan. They wanted to deliver the paratroopers and gliders to the set drop zones where they were supposed to. All right, now we're fine-tuned it a little bit more, and we're going to go back into Eindhoven a little bit on how things happened with the 502nd and the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiments. When they went in, I talked about the bridge here at Best that wasn't, this is the one that actually stayed intact. The center bridge in Eindhoven was taken, and the bridge at Somme was the one you see in the movie as the colonel standing there chewing a cigar that was blown up right behind him. That bridge was actually blown up. Kind of an interesting fact with the 501st here is not only did they seize this town, but the next little town up here, the Uden, where I used to live, they had one rifle company run to that town and defend that town from the Germans running from building to building. They kept an entire infantry battalion from coming in. These guys literally ran from house to house shooting out windows to scare the Germans off. And that came out of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment. Next slide. Now we're going to focus in on the Nijmegen drop zones. As I pointed out in the movie, you see Robert Redford, but what they don't say is he actually parachuted in over here on this side of the Grava Bridge. Then he had to move by foot all the way into Nijmegen, and then he's told, hey, guess what? Now you're going to cross the river in a boat. So here's a paratrooper doing the unheard of thing of doing a river assault. These bridges were taken here pretty quickly. The gliders from 325 Glider Infantry Regiment landed here on the overall assault landing zone where the 504th also landed. They secured bridges over here as well. And then over on Grosbeek Heights, this is key terrain here. It's the high ground in the Netherlands. Everybody thinks of the Netherlands as underwater and flat. This is actually a big hill, is what it is. And the 508th and 505th Parachute Infantry Regiments went in there. And what people don't know is a key thing right here happened with the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Is you know what this little dotted line is here? That's the German border. They actually crossed into Germany. It was the first Allied unit to cross into Germany. It was the 82nd Airborne Division with their 3rd Brigade Combat Team, these guys. And they crossed in right here, and they actually stayed there quite some time. The 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment went in here, and they went to take the main bridge in Nijmegen, but the railroad bridge is the one that you see in the movie where they did the river crossing to take. Now I'm going to focus in on Arnhem. This is way out there. You see the scale down here? That's 1 mile. Here's the bridge. These guys had to go hoof it on foot with all their equipment into here and take this one. This was General Sosabowski's landing zone on this side. You know, as a paratrooper, that to me, I would put everybody there and just, rush right to the bridge, and you could have held it. Because you would have had all your forces there instead of, now I have to have guys to stay here to secure the drop zone so we can get resupplied. Now I'm about 6 to 7 miles away from my objective. I have to maintain my lines of communication, all of this route. So this was a failure on the planner's part right here. They should have focused all their combat power down in here in these 2 drop zones instead of out over in this area. So that was a failure on the operation. And I don't blame the paratroopers for that. That was a planner's mistake. If they would have asked a paratrooper, they would have been, dude, you're crazy. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that behind enemy lines and then have to run 6, 7 miles to get to my objective. The idea of a paratrooper is you land on your objective. Everybody's like, why do you jump out of a perfect good airplane? I don't want to walk. So that's the key. As a paratrooper, you can literally land on your objective and you're good to go. So that's a failure in this operation. Next slide.
You see this in the film where the Germans capture the plans. There's a theory or a belief that they only captured the 101st plans. But if they got the 101st plans, they knew where the 82nd was landing. They knew where the British Airborne was landing. So all they had to do was literally connect the dots to know what Market Garden was all about. So that's essentially what happened. The student figured out almost immediately. That was passed on to Model and Bittrick. They thought that the key was going to be Nijmegen in the center. That if they could prevent the bridges being captured in Nijmegen, that isolates the people up in Arnhem, that brings the entire operation to a halt. When Hitler was informed, he wants everything to go to them, including what's left of the Luftwaffe. Bittrick, the head of the Panzers, wanted to destroy the bridges at Arnhem and Nijmegen. Model refused. Hitler would not be happy. You have to remember, German officers tried to kill Hitler shortly after D-Day. So, he's suspicious of everybody right now. The one thing they said in the film that was wrong was that Model didn't accept the plans as being accurate. He did. So the Germans had a pretty clear indication of what was going to happen. And again, Model is Führer's fireman. He's going to take the resources at hand. Within 3 hours after the initial Allied drops, he knows what they're going to do. He's reacting, and that's a big part of it. That's another thing in the movie is they're talking about how we're going to do this and this and this and this, and Sosabowski, the Polish commander, says, anybody thought about the Germans? Are they going to cooperate? Maybe not.
Like from the German perspective, they're, what they put into against the 101st Airborne in Arnhem was not really effective. The good thing was the 101st Airborne was the first ones to link up with 30 Corps, so the heavy armor arrived to support them, which was able to counter tanks. Paratroopers, they got bazookas. They don't have main guns off tanks. There's a big difference there. So that was key. They were able to take Eindhoven and liberate it very quickly. Nijmegen was a little different story. The 2nd Parachute Corps, which was made up of the 9th and 10th, I'm thinking the Panzers up in Arnhem. The Parachute Corps was pushed in from Cologne to reinforce the Germans at the bridge. You see the Germans wanting to blow the bridge up. Well, wasn't really what was going to happen. They were supposed to hold the bridge, not destroy it. And that is the main road bridge that you see. The conflict revolved around the railway bridge. And the Germans put up such stiff resistance there that the idea came up that, oh, we're going to do a river assault now. You can see the comment here that they tried to recapture Grosbeek Heights. What's key for that is artillery. The artillery that the 82nd Airborne brought in could range anything they needed from those heights. The Germans wanted it because they knew they could do the same thing. But the 82nd Airborne hold Grosbeek Heights, and their artillery went up there to support the operation from there. Arnhem, a whole different story. The 2nd Panzer Corps, which put the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, which are tanks that were there to rest and recover. Paratroopers don't fight tanks, let alone 2 divisions of tanks with a division minus of paratroopers, because they couldn't put all their guys on the ground quick enough. They didn't have all the support they needed, so they're outgunned and outnumbered. They held one end of the bridge the entire time. They held it, I want to say it's 10 days, which is unheard of against overwhelming odds. The Germans' plan is keep the airborne forces from taking the bridges, blow them up if you have to. That was the initial plan. Those were the smaller bridges along the canals, but the main Rhine River bridges they didn't want to blow up because they knew they'd have to use them in the future, so they didn't want them blown up. And prevent airborne forces from being reinforced and resupplied. You see a picture of that in the movie where they stand on the drop zone and start shooting paratroopers out of the sky, which is completely legal under the Geneva Convention because they are not pilots ejecting. They are come to do business and create harm on the ground when they get there. They're not there as an unarmed non-combatant. They're combatants in the air. It was completely in line with the Geneva Convention. Most people don't think you can't shoot paratroopers. You can. They knew where they were coming down. They knew where all the reinforcements were. The British had challenges on the drop zones because they were so far away. Their forces were dispersed. So what do? Do you hold your key objective? Do you hold your drop zones? So they had like 6 drop zones. So they had multiple objectives they're trying to hold. They didn't have the manpower to do it. And they were so dispersed, they couldn't support it. There was no way they could support each other. And the Germans wanted to slow down the tanks. It's easy. You shoot the tank in the front of the column, they got to clear the road. And you keep doing that up and down the road, and your 2-day battle turns into a 10-day battle, and you lose tanks all the way along the way. Their intent was to cut Hell's Highway in half and isolate 30 Corps en route and cut airborne forces off and annihilate them.
The movie never really discusses that. You think, well, once 30 Corps takes the road, they keep the road. No, Germans come in behind them and take it back, so they don't even talk about that.
This is a huge punch into the Netherlands. Like I said, it's 67 miles, so the Germans' intent is they could cut this road off anywhere along the way in here. So the Americans take this, they can come in on the other side and come around and cut off resupplies from that way as well. This is a different map showing the areas, more drop zones in a different perspective. This is actually taken in the Netherlands from a Dutch museum. And you can see where the people were going into here, and this is the little town I was talking about where they ran from this bridge to this little town, which is about 3.5 miles, and held that town. There's actually also an American base over here still now. That's still an air base over there. Next slide. All right, the 506 Parachute Infantry, everybody knows them as Band of Brothers, Echo Company 506. There's more than just Echo Company. They took the Wilhelmina Canal at Somme, that's the one the Germans blew up, and then they put in a Bailey Bridge, which is right here. You know, it's a man-made bridge. You go in and they could cross there, but they also took the bridge at Best, which you had 2 bridges over that canal at that time, and they're already 36 hours behind schedule. This was supposed to happen in 48 hours, and this is in the first city. We move on into Nijmegen, which are their 2 major bridges here, the railroad bridge and the road bridge. So as I talked about, as you see in the movie, and you know, it's Robert Redford and dashing and all this, he was dashing from here all the way up to there. And then he gets that, as a former rifle company commander in the Army, that's not a mission that I want to do a river assault after doing a parachute assault and losing all your men, or not all your men, but you're taking heavy casualties along the way. And now you're asked to do almost the impossible. And they figured it was an impossible task when they did it. When they were asked to do that, you expect me to do what? You want me to take the bridge from the German side of the river. And they actually did. And the intent was the British tanks were going to secure this side, and the American paratroopers were going to secure that side. Well, the American paratroopers secured that side of it. A side note, what you don't see in the movie is Major Julian was actually awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, which is the second highest award for heroism here, for his actions that he did, jumping, making a combat parachute jump here, and more importantly, that river assault. This is more on the 82nd Airborne Division's operations. They had more problems. It was time there. You have the Grava Bridge, the Human Bridge. They didn't have a lot of people to do what they needed to do. There were so many bridges. They had the most bridges to secure in the largest area to cover. And there were multiple attempts to take the Nijmegen Highway Bridge that failed, waiting for 30 Corps. That's when I talked about the amphibious assault, otherwise what I call a river assault, and flimsy boats. And they're not the boats that you want to be in. They're canvas boats propped up with wood like you see in the movie. They're not the greatest boat in the world to do a river crossing in, let alone a combat assault. As it talks about here, is 3504 that actually did the river crossing, the 26 flimsy boats. Half made it. It took 6 total crossings to get across. The first wave took the brunt of it. Once they were there, they were able to distract Germans on the far side of the river, because the more pressing action in front of them was these little American paratroopers running at you and right in front of you, other than the guys in the boats. So the initial assault wave took the brunt of that, and they lost most of the people on the initial assault across the river. The additional waves made it across, and when it was over, there was only a few boats that were left. They were able to capture the bridge, and 30 Corps rolled across the bridge from the other end. As he states here, one of the greatest feats in the U.S. Army ever. After spending 16 years in the 82nd Airborne Division, that's still one of the greatest feats of the 82nd Airborne Division's non-parachute jump or river assault.
Well, and think about this, and the film shows this really well. 30 Corps was in Nijmegen for 35 hours before that bridge was captured. After they got over the bridge, you've got that scene with Robert Redford with the tankers just sitting there drinking tea. They waited another 24 hours before they continued. So the British up in Arnhem are being annihilated, and 30 Corps is not doing everything in their power to move as quickly as they can.
So the British tankers aren't supporting their fellow Brits. They're on the far side of the river in Arnhem. They're not on the near side. They're on the opposite side of the river in Arnhem, and not on the side towards Nijmegen. As you can see it here, they were holding the bridge from this side. All of 30 Corps' tanks were down here, just stopped, waiting. It took them a day to do that. And then the decision was ultimately made to do the tactical withdrawal and come back across the river. And that's what they did, and that's what they call it, a bridge too far. That's where the name of it comes from. They think there was a bridge too far. And this is where you'll see Doc and I differ at the end in there on opinions on this. This is the Arnhem Bridge as it looked in 1944. This is the 82nd Airborne and 30 Corps tanks were over here. British paratroopers were over here. And they held that side of the bridge the entire time, all 10 days.
You'll see in the next slide, 500 guys did that. Unbelievable.
Yeah. Colonel Frost's 2nd Parachute Battalion, 500 men. They're the ones that reached the bridge and held it. So those 500 guys stood there and fought and died for 10 days to hold that bridge. And it was just one end. They're not saying, they actually initially captured the bridge, and then they lost the far end, and then they could never retake the far end.
Why did the 38 gliders fail to arrive? Was it weather, or was it something?
A lot of it was the tow lines broke. So it wasn't the weather. They had clear weather coming in that first day. The tow lines broke, and I think when the tow lines break, there's, you know better than I, Colonel, gliders can't do a whole lot when they're not being towed.
They go down. That's it. As you can see here, is 8 miles. So they had to get there. And that they're just talking about getting their Jeeps there. That's what the guys had to go on to. As I talked about, their welcoming surprise was 2 SS tank divisions, SS Panzer divisions. These were tank divisions that were there. And they entered the fight, and it was a game changer for them. They had the advantage, and they had the initiative at that point. The Brits are surrounded by the Germans. on their side of the canal, I'm sorry, their side of the river in the city, and the Germans also hold the other side of the bridge, so they can't just go back across the bridge to retreat. They're stuck on the other side of a major river.
I like this here. The Dutch underground message to the American paratroopers: Germans are winning over the British at Arnhem. I mean, think about it. You've got this elaborate plan. We're going to do this, 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 and that. You land on 2 SS Panzer divisions. It becomes, let's try not to get killed.
This is what you talk about here, is they had 10,000 paratroopers go into Arnhem, about 2,500 came out. So 7,500 guys killed or wounded or prisoners at that point. They took a beating. Most of the time when airborne forces go into operations, they expect a 30% casualty rate. This is 75%. That's a waste of human resources right there and guys on the ground. And they just couldn't get there. The British tanks couldn't get there to support them, whether they were stopped on the road or they just stopped waiting for further instructions instead of maintaining initiative and pushing to the objective.
This is basically kind of an overview. And when I say fail, again, we'll talk about that, but why couldn't they advance 30 Corps through and over the Arnhem Bridge? Quick and coordinated German response, 30 Corps incapable of keeping the schedule. The Bailey Bridge held them up for 36 hours. As the colonel was saying, British 1st Airborne dropped so far away that almost inherently prevented them from achieving success. Good weather on the initial drop day, but after that, real trouble getting reinforcements, resupplies, communication failures, radios not working. And I see this a lot. What could have been an excellent campaign fell apart due to multiple execution failures. In other words, if everything goes according to plan, if everybody does their job, maybe, but they didn't. Numbers and losses, as Colonel was saying, about 75% casualties to the British and Polish forces. This here, 7.4% of the intended supplies to the troops in Arnhem got to them. What does that mean? Food, medical supplies, ammunition. This also shows you the 21,000 by parachute and 18,000 by glider. So a lot came in by glider. Operation Berlin was the attempt to rescue what was left of the forces in Arnhem, and they got 2,500 troops back. This shows you the losses to the 82nd and the 101st. Total Allied casualties over 16,000. German casualties estimated at about 8,000.
And you see the difference there with the 82nd and 101st. They're in no way in comparison to what British 1st Airborne lost.
Week after the operation, the British Airborne returns to a hero's welcome in England, followed by the Polish Brigade. What happens to the Americans? They're stuck there. The 82nd stays in place till 13 November. The 101st stays in place till 27 November.
These are key things I want you to remember, so when Doc and I start arguing at the end, focus on this section right here. There was a little town on a map that I wanted to point out, a little town called Overloon, that most people know nothing about. There was a major tank battle that happened there October-November time period. So, but look at these dates and what happens pretty soon after that.
And Monty blamed himself for almost nothing and blamed Ike for almost everything.
His exact terms were the operation was a 90% success.
So if you look at it from that perspective, got almost all the way to Arnhem, 30 Corps. We did engage and diminish German forces, so we're winning the war of attrition. This was the deepest airborne penetration in history, with 2 of the 3 divisions achieving success at that time. And the 3 airborne division, these assets of the Allies, were brought into the war. So we did accomplish some stuff. Why did it fail? Or how do we talk about the failure? Well, Arnhem Bridge isn't captured. War's not over in 1944. extreme losses to the British and the Polish. Monty's single thrust concept detracts from the ongoing broad front. Everybody else has their fuel taken away while we wait for this. And despite placating Monty, Ike continues to deal with a contentious and insubordinate leader. So Monty wasn't humbled after this, he was more conceited than ever. Impact on the Battle of the Bulge, here's where we'll disagree a little bit. I'll start off. Based on my research, because of where the troops were positioned after Operation Market Garden, we had a single American Army corps stretched thinly to cover the Ardennes, which is where the Germans attacked through, which gave the Germans the opportunity to have that initial powerful, successful thrust.
And my counter to this is that little thing that everybody knows in the Battle of the Bulge. How many of these German forces are now tied up in the Netherlands dealing with British and Canadian tanks and American paratroopers? That little thing I pointed out in November, Battle of the Bulge happened in December. The Germans couldn't count on putting those units into the Ardennes for that offensive to punch into Bastogne. If they could have put those forces there, the 101st Airborne Division would have been wiped out in Bastogne. They could have not survived that. That the Germans had to move forces to keep the occupying forces in the Netherlands at bay. But I wanted to point that out. That's a big thing. We always look and say Market Garden was a failure. I don't think it was. We achieved liberating parts of the Netherlands. Did continue in battles, continue in the Netherlands after that, all the way up into the Battle of the Bulge? Yes, they did. If this wouldn't have happened and we would have maintained that stagnant line along the Belgian border, the Germans would have had all that combat power to thrust into that area, and they would have overwhelmed the forces that were there. So everybody wants to say Market Garden was a failure. I don't see it as that way. You can talk to most paratroopers and they'll tell you the same thing. They achieved what they wanted to. Their goal was to liberate part of the Netherlands and secure bridges, and they did that. They didn't get the final bridge, but they also don't point out that they also crossed into Germany, and people always forget that piece or don't know it, that the American 82nd Airborne Division was the first Allied force to cross the German border, and they stayed in Germany up until almost November. You see that if you don't know much about the Battle of the Bulge. It was the 101st Airborne that was moved from the Netherlands to go and refit and recoup in France. And while they were doing that, they were pushed into Bastogne as an emergency reinforcement. So these guys were going to do the same thing that the German tankers were going to do. They were going to go back here and refit, and then they were thrown into the fight there. But my counter to Doc's is these forces had to stay in the Netherlands and couldn't be used in a plan for further operations because they're dealing with action still in the Netherlands.
It's tough to disagree when you have all the facts on your side.
All right, Governor.
Lessons learned, at least back then, don't drop the paratroopers so far behind enemy lines. D-Day was successful because the forces on the beaches were not 64 miles away from the troops. After Market Garden, March of '45 was Operation Varsity, successful airborne operation, which 2 airborne divisions landed in 2 hours, only 5 miles from the infantry, and it was a successful operation across the Rhine River. So we learned and we profited from the experience. Bridge too far. We'll talk about this real quick. Said a bunch of you had seen it. War in the movies, realistic portrayal of the campaign, early enthusiasm followed by the realities of war. Every time I watch the movie and I think, oh, they made that up, they didn't. They made up hardly anything, but the only thing that I can really point at was Model saying, these are not the real plans. He knew they were the real plans, so that the movie kind of Hollywooded that up a little bit. I'm always taken by how beautiful the city of Arnhem is at the beginning of the film, and by the end it's rubble. So I think they do a good job with that. And despite the all-star cast, the actors realistically portrayed their real-life counterparts. Now, why was it accurate? If you watch the credits, a lot of people don't do that. Look who was military advisors to this film. Major General Frost. They were the battalion that held the bridge at Arnhem. He was right there. General Gavin, commander of 82nd Airborne. Horrocks, head of 30 Corps. Urquhart, headed the 1st British Airborne, and Vandeleur, he was the Michael Caine part. He was the gentleman who led the Irish Guards, the leading element of 34. So the fact that you had these people, hopefully on set, advising the filmmakers, you got a pretty accurate film. Some thoughts. In my prejudiced view, if the operation had been properly backed from its inception, and given the aircraft, ground forces, and administrative resources necessary for the job, it would have succeeded, in spite of my mistakes, or the adverse weather, or the presence of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps in the Arnhem area. I remain Market Garden's unrepentant advocate. So speaketh Montgomery. So a couple of SS Panzer divisions in Arnhem, still should have worked. Still a great idea. And finally,
Prince of the Netherlands comments, my country can never again afford the luxury of another Montgomery success.